The night of the Winter Ball at Luhan Palace. For several weeks, the night of the Winter Ball at Luhan Palace had been announced as the main event of the season. Sparkling carriages pulled up one after another, releasing ladies wrapped in silks and gentlemen fresh from their mane tailcoats. Their glass panes gleamed as the chandeliers spilled golden light. The orchestra tuned their violins while the hum of conversations filled the vast hall. Emily Rubles cautiously stepped down from the carriage, holding her light blue dress that her mother had carefully mended. It was neither new nor entirely in line with the latest fashion, but it sat with an elegance independent of trends. Entering the hall, she felt the music envelop her along with the mingled scent of expensive perfumes, wax, and fresh flowers. Her mother, Widow Rubles, gently squeezed her hand. "Remember, daughter," she whispered with a serene smile, "you don't need to dazzle anyone. Just be yourself." Emily nodded, though she knew that in this world, being a young girl without a dowry or a significant surname was almost the same as being invisible. And yet, it wasn't the feeling of invisibility that struck her most that evening, but the presence of a man who, despite his title and fame, seemed even lonelier than she did. The Duke de Valcastle sat at the far end of the hall, by one of the tall windows. His tall, straight figure stood out easily. Dark, slightly curly hair, a firm jaw, impeccable posture. He wore a black suit of perfect cut, an ivory-coloured waistcoat, and a neatly tied cravat. The cane leaning against the chair left no doubt about his condition, nor did his pale grey eyes, which seemed to look without seeing. Emily caught something barely perceptible in the air around him. An empty space, meticulously maintained by all. Young ladies strolling with fans and light laughter veered away without getting too close. Gentlemen, courteous in appearance, averted their gazes. No one mocked him, no one pointed at him, but no one approached either. The orchestra struck up a waltz, and the master of ceremonies announced in a solemn voice the official start of the dances. The gentlemen stepped forward, inviting the ladies. The dresses swirled like flowers in a garden whipped by the wind. And there, amid that whirlwind of colours, the Duke remained motionless, hands on his knees, listening. Emily couldn't tear her gaze away. "They say he lost his sight several years ago," noted a young woman with blonde curls beside her, adjusting her glove. "A sudden illness. Since then, he hardly dances. They say many things," added another in a hushed tone. "That he's become withdrawn, that no one knows what he thinks, that is impossible to please." The words glided through the air, soft in form, but Emily felt a slight lump in her chest. She looked at the Duke again. Withdrawn, perhaps, but impossible to understand if no one approached. The master of ceremonies passed by, announcing that ladies without partners could still proceed to the centre of the hall. Emily felt her mother's encouraging gaze from a distant seat. She took a deep breath. Her feet seemed to want to carry her in another direction. Toward him. At first, the thought seemed excessive, almost indecent. An insignificant girl inviting the Duke to dance? She glanced around. No one seemed inclined to break that silent distance. No one would extend a hand to him. He would sit there, listening to the waltz without participating in it. And realizing this, Emily, with unexpected clarity, saw that it was cruel. Her steps began to move before she could make a conscious decision. She crossed the hall, feeling her heart pounding against her ribs, sensing some gazes lingering on her. First curious, then puzzled. She no longer heard the whispers, only the rustle of her skirt and the music guiding her. She stopped a few steps from the Duke. Now she could examine his face more closely. Calm, with an almost imperceptible tension in the line of his jaw, as if he were accustomed to watching the world without seeing it. "Your Grace," said Emily, striving for her voice to sound firm and respectful. The Duke turned his face toward her, guided by the sound of her voice. His grey, dull eyes searched the space with cautious calm, not disoriented. "Good evening," he replied in a deep, well-modulated voice. "Forgive me, with whom do I have the honour of speaking?" Emily felt her palms grow damp inside her gloves. "Emily Rubles, Your Grace." A short silence followed, broken only by the waltz music. Emily felt the entire hall beginning to notice this small focal point. Attentions shifted from the illuminated centre to the corner where the Duke sat. She took another deep breath. "I came to ask you," she said, weaving a thread of courage she hadn't suspected she possessed. "Would you do me the honour of this dance?" In the very moment Emily extended her hand toward him, the whisper in the hall seemed to dissolve. Fans froze in the air, conversations broke off mid-sentence. The orchestra continued playing, but every gaze was fixed on this unusual scene. A girl in a blue dress with a determined gaze took the hand of the blind Duke, and for an instant, frozen in time, no one dared even breathe. The silence became so profound that Emily thought she could hear her own heartbeat mingled with the notes of the waltz. The Duke's hand remained motionless on his knees, warm in the black glove, and his grey eyes seemed to search the twilight between them. He didn't withdraw his hand, but neither did he take hers immediately. "Miss," he pronounced finally, "do you realize that everyone is looking at you?" A blush flooded Emily's face, but she didn't withdraw her extended hand. "I suppose so, Your Grace," she replied softly. "However, I also know that they've been looking at you all evening. No one has approached." A flicker of something light, almost imperceptible, flashed in the Duke's gesture. It wasn't a smile, but something akin to restrained surprise. "You are quite frank," he noted. "Not everyone would dare say it like that." "Perhaps not everyone finds it unfair," whispered Emily. Then, with a slow and deliberate motion, the Duke raised his hand and placed it on her palm. His touch was firm, confident, as if the darkness hadn't fully robbed him of his former assurance. "Well, Miss Rubles," he said, "if you are ready to withstand the gazes, I shall gift you this dance." When he rose, the air around seemed to tighten. The master of ceremonies, watching them from afar with an anxious expression, took a step as if about to intervene, but restrained himself upon seeing the determination on Emily's face. Some gentlemen exchanged incredulous glances, several ladies raised their fans to hide nervous smiles. Emily took a step forward, delicately guiding the Duke to the center of the hall. He leaned briefly on the cane, which he then handed to a servant, and straightened with the elegance of a man who had once been the finest dancer at any evening. As they stepped onto the parquet, the orchestra, as if sensing that something extraordinary was about to happen, linked the end of the waltz to a new one, slower, more melancholic. Emily placed her free hand on the Duke's shoulder, and he encircled her waist with respectful caution, maintaining the exact distance. "Describe the space," he requested quietly. "I haven't danced in a full hall in a long time." "To the right, pairs," she whispered obediently. "To the left, a small empty circle, as if the hall had parted for us. Behind, a multitude of gazers." Naturally, he replied with a shade of irony. "And ahead, Miss Rubles, what is there?" Emily swallowed, aware that her eyes were fixed on his, though he couldn't see it. "Ahead, Your Grace, is you." The Duke exhaled slowly, as if that simple answer, at first glance, had pierced the armor he himself had built. The music enveloped them. At first, Emily's feet moved with extreme caution, fearing to stumble or lead him astray, but soon she discovered that the Duke followed the rhythm with astonishing precision. He didn't need to see the floor, his body remembered. The light turns, the firmness of his hand on her waist, the exact step in every beat. If someone closed their eyes, they would scarcely guess that one of them couldn't see. "You dance beautifully," said Emily almost in a whisper. "I danced," he corrected without sharpness, a shadow in his voice. "Now I'm merely trying not to step on my partner's toes." "You haven't done so once," she replied with a smile he could only infer from her tone. "And if you did, it wouldn't be so terrible." They glided across the hall, and the whisper returned. First timid, then louder. Comments, sighs, hasty interpretations. "She must want to attract the Duke's attention," murmured a female voice. "Or perhaps she's seeking sympathy," added another. "A girl without a dowry always needs a dramatic ploy." Emily heard fragments of phrases that stung her like fine needles, but forced herself to hold her head high. The Duke, though he couldn't see the faces, seemed to sense the tension. "They are speaking of you," he said calmly. "I know. I can request that you be escorted back if it's too uncomfortable." Emily looked intently at him, feeling that in this moment something important was being decided. "I didn't come here to flee at the first malicious remark, Your Grace." A short silence fell, and then, for the first time since the dance began, the Duke smiled genuinely. It was a faint, almost sad smile, but real. "In that case," he said, "allow me at least to share with you the burden of these gazers." He held her a little firmer, leading with such confidence that several pairs parted, yielding the way. It seemed the orchestra played only for them. When the waltz reached its climax, one figure rose from the guests. The hostess, the Marquise de Laune, with slightly furrowed brows and a calculating gleam in her eyes. She took a few steps toward the parquet, as if about to intervene and say something capable of changing the course of the evening. The Marquise de Lon moved with measured steps. Her wide ivory-colored dress slid across the floor like a restrained wave. She made no attempt to interrupt the waltz, but her mere presence at the edge of the parquet was enough to slow several pairs, awaiting what she would say. Emily felt her heart skip a beat. The Duke, however, seemed to catch the shift in atmosphere without alarm. "Someone is approaching," he noted quietly. The whisper changes when the Marquise decides to move. "You know her well, Your Grace," replied Emily, striving to speak calmly. The music continued, and they kept circling with restrained elegance until the Marquise stopped a few steps away, close enough for her words to reach only them, but at a proper distance to observe propriety. "Your Grace, Duke de Valcastle," she greeted with a slight bow of her head. "What joy to see you participating in the dances." The Duke slowed the waltz step without stopping completely, inclining his head barely in acknowledgement. "Marquise, your ball is magnificent as always." The Marquise's eyes turned to Emily, scanning her from head to toe with such polished courtesy that it was impossible to guess her true thoughts. "And you, miss?" She left the phrase hanging in the air. Emily Rubles, "Madam," responded. "It is an honor to be here this evening." "Rubles," repeated the Marquise, as if tasting the sound of the surname. "I'm not sure I remember your family." "Not surprising, Marquise," interjected the Duke gently. "Not everyone bears surnames that resound in the salons, but a sensitive ear discovers pearls that the eye sometimes overlooks." Emily felt a slight warmth in her chest. It wasn't a direct compliment, but in those words lay an elegant defense that placed her beside him, leaving her in plain view. The Marquise smiled a little wider than necessary. "Always so witty, Your Grace. Glad you found a partner for the dance willing to share your boldness." Emily caught the nuance in that phrase, not exactly a reprimand, but containing a subtle hint that the scene wouldn't go unnoticed in society's memory. "The music led us," said Emily with the best smile she could muster. "And your ball, Marquise, would be a shame not to make use of it." The Marquise held her gaze a second longer, as if assessing the young woman's composure, then with a light gesture of assent, stepped back. Then, without wishing to disturb, she concluded, "Enjoy the waltz." When she withdrew, the air seemed to ease a bit. Several pairs returned to their usual rhythm. The orchestra, obliging, allowed the melody to flow to a natural close. "You handled it well, Miss Rubles," said the Duke quietly. "Not everyone keeps their composure before the Marquise." "I wasn't as calm as I seemed, Your Grace," she confessed. "But I thought that since they saw me cross the hall to invite you to dance, the worst was already behind me." He let out a short, muffled chuckle. "There's convincing logic in that." The waltz ended in a soft cadence. Emily stepped back with a proper curtsy. The Duke responded with an impeccable bow, guided by habit. The applause was restrained, but it was there, and that fact alone brought a slight lump to Emily's throat. Someone, at least, had appreciated the dance not only for what it signified, but for the genuine beauty of the movement. "Would you like me to escort you to your mother?" asked the Duke. "If it's not a burden to you." She took his arm again, crossing the hall. Emily noticed that some gazers had softened. Less curious, more thoughtful. Others, conversely, assessed her with a mix of curiosity and wariness. There was no open contempt, but there were silent questions. Widow Rubles rose upon seeing them approach. Her dark, attentive eyes shifted from the Duke to her daughter's hand intertwined with his. "Your Grace," she greeted, inclining her head respectfully. "Madame Rubles," he replied. "Your daughter has done me the courtesy of saving me from too quiet an evening." A blush coloured Emily's face. Her mother, however, smiled with a dignity that for a moment made her seem far more than the widow of a modest steward. "Then I thank you, Your Grace, for the honour bestowed." "It has been a pleasure," replied the Duke. A short silence fell. Emily felt he was about to depart and gathered a bit of courage. "Do you often attend balls, Your Grace?" she asked. He paused a moment before answering. "I used to, when I still had my sight. The ballroom was almost a second home." His voice lowered a tone. "Afterward, I preferred places where the silence weighs less." "Perhaps," said Emily cautiously, "it's not the hall, but what people decide not to say." The Duke turned slightly toward her, as if that phrase had awakened something. "Perhaps you are right, miss. I would be willing to test that theory if you would consent to another meeting, in a place where words can have more space than gazes." Emily parted her lips in surprise. "Another meeting?" "A quieter conversation," he clarified. Perhaps in a gallery, away from the noise, if your mother permits. The eyes of Widow Rubles met her daughter's in that gaze mingled prudent concern and a spark of hope Emily hadn't seen in a long time. If it suits my daughter, said the widow, I have no objections. Emily lowered her gaze slightly to hide the surging emotion. Yes, Your Grace, it would be an honor. The Duke smiled almost imperceptibly. Then, when the orchestra changes pieces, I shall send a servant to inform you. Perhaps this evening need not be remembered only for its silence. The orchestra changed pieces, and the whisper in the hall rose anew, as if the tension of that waltz had hung in the air for a moment. Soon, a servant approached Emily and her mother with a respectful bow. His Grace, the Duc de Valcastle, inquires if the ladies would care to join him in the inner gallery, he announced in a voice not too loud. Widow Rubles looked at Emily, and in her eyes mingled the usual caution and something akin to timid hope. We shall go, she replied before her daughter could hesitate. The gallery stretched along a corridor lit by tall windows framed by the night, like a dark painting. Outside, the garden slept in pale moonlight inside. The silence was barely disturbed by the distant echo of music. The Duke awaited them standing by a small marble table on which burned 2 candelabras more modest than those in the main hall. The soft light gave his face a serene, almost nostalgic look. Thank you for accepting my invitation, he said, inclining his head toward where he guessed their presence. Sometimes one conversation is worth more than 100 dances. I think I understand, Your Grace, replied Emily. Allow me to offer you a seat, he continued. Widow Rubles tactfully sat in the nearest armchair, ceding the conversation, as it was evident the Duke wished. For Emily, it was no negligence but a silent trust in her daughter's discretion. How long ago did you lose your sight, Your Grace? Asked Emily after a few moments, cautiously. If the question displeases you, please say so. The Duke smiled almost imperceptibly. The discomfort is not in the question, but in what one decides to silence. He fell silent briefly. 4 years ago. A prolonged fever, complications, and suddenly the lights went out. Emily lowered her gaze, though he couldn't see it. It must have been very hard. Perhaps. But even harder was seeing the reactions of those around when I could still make out something. His voice dropped half a tone. Those who hurried to offer help, and those who vanished with astonishing speed. Invitations grew scarce, smiles became cautious, and for some reason, balls turned into stages where I no longer had a place. And yet you came this evening, noted Emily. At the insistence of an old friend and the Marquise de Lon herself. There was no cold bitterness in his tone, only honesty. They thought seclusion fed unnecessary rumors. I suppose they were right. He turned his face slightly toward her. But I didn't expect someone to cross the hall to invite me to dance. Emily blushed, glad the light was dim. I simply thought it unfair for the music to surround you without touching you. Many thought the same, he replied, but preferred not to act. You acted. That distinguishes you. She hesitated a moment. In truth, I'm accustomed to not being noticed, she confessed quietly. Not because of lack of sight, of course, but lack of significance. My father was an honest steward, but without fortune. He died leaving debts that my mother has paid with great effort. She insisted on bringing me to this ball, though my dress has been mended more than once. She smiled shyly. Here, girls who bring no generous dowry usually blend into the tapestries. The Duke inclined his head slightly, as if observing her with other senses. Perhaps a curious fate unites us. They look at me too much but don't see me. They see you without truly looking. Emily pondered. She had never phrased it that way, but it was strangely true. A short, cozy silence followed. From afar came laughter, sporadic applause, the changeable hum of another life continuing to spin without them. Do you regret anything, Your Grace? Asked Emily suddenly, surprised by the boldness of her words. All of this? The Duke tensed almost imperceptibly. I regret taking admiration for sincere attachment. There was a time when I thought the world belonged to me. Youth, health, enviable position. His voice darkened. I was engaged to a young lady from a respected and well-known family. When the illness came, so did the excuses. The wedding was postponed first out of caution, then for convenience. Soon after I lost my sight, I received a letter. Courteous, elegant, irrefutable. The engagement was broken. Emily felt a void in her chest. "I'm so sorry." "I'm not seeking sympathy," he said softly, "but I appreciate your sincerity." "That wasn't what I meant to express," she objected, slightly embarrassed. "It just seems cruel to abandon someone precisely when they need support most." He turned his face toward where he imagined her eyes. "I think the story doesn't end there. A blind duke in the social season that flows around him without touching him. But this evening, a young, clear voice approached and invited me to dance, as if there were nothing to fear." The quiet force of his words made Emily feel a slight tremor in her hands. Unbeknownst to them, in the semi-darkness of the gallery a few steps away behind a column, a figure stopped. A pair of observant eyes, accustomed to assessing every gesture, watched the scene with calculating attention. The Marquise de Laune, who had come to ensure her noble guest didn't feel neglected, heard the words broken engagement and letter, and narrowed her eyes, intrigued by what this conversation might mean for the social game she so loved to direct. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the window of Emily's small bedroom, seeping through the worn curtains. The house was modest but impeccably neat. Every book in its place, every embroidery neatly folded. The blue dress lay on a chair, its folds still holding traces of the waltz's movements. Emily rose slowly, as if fearing that all she'd experienced the night before would crumble with the first abrupt motion. Had she really danced with the Duke? Had she really felt his firm hand leading and his low voice so close to her ear? She closed her eyes for a moment, recalling the rhythm of the music and how the whole world seemed to have frozen when she extended her hand to him. A soft knock at the door made her open her eyes. "Come in," she said. Her mother entered with a tray. Simple coffee and toasted bread. Her eyes betrayed a night interrupted by too many thoughts. "Good morning." "Good morning, Mama." Widow Rubles set the tray on the small table and sat opposite, as if she'd rehearsed this conversation for hours. "I've thought a lot about last night," she began, "and about your boldness and its consequences." Emily clutched the blanket with her hands. "Do you think I was imprudent?" Her mother looked at her with tenderness. "I think you acted as your heart dictated. That's rarely imprudent. But the world." She sighed. "The world isn't always ready to understand justice when it comes from someone without title or fortune." "They'll talk about me," Emily acknowledged. "Perhaps they already are." "Agreed," conceded the widow, "but they'll also talk about him. That he danced again, that someone dared treat him as a full person and not a shadow. And though you may not believe it, sometimes rumors die when they have nothing to feed on but shame." Before Emily could respond, another knock sounded, this time at the front door. Both exchanged surprised glances. The widow rose and went to the small entryway. Emily heard muffled voices, the rustle of paper being handed over, then returning steps. Her mother re-entered, holding envelopes of good paper, with sealing wax and a seal from which, even from afar, the embossed coat of arms could be distinguished. "It's for you," she said quietly. "From the Duke de Valcastle." Emily felt her heart leap. She took the envelope with trembling hands, carefully broke the seal, and unfolded the letter. "Miss Rubles. Last night, for the first time in a long while, music regained its meaning for me. Your act gifted me not only a dance but something I thought lost. The chance to be seen beyond my blindness. If it doesn't seem inappropriate to you, I would like to invite you, along with your esteemed mother, to tea this afternoon in the gardens of the Marquise de Laune. She has kindly placed them at my disposal for a more private meeting. I would like to know you better, hear you without the hall's noise, and perhaps discuss a matter that has troubled me since last night. With sincere respect, Valcastle." Emily raised stunned eyes. "He wants us to see him again? In the Marquise's gardens?" Widow Rubles frowned slightly. "The Marquise de Laune takes no step without intent. If she offers her gardens, she has seen something that intrigues her in these potential relations. Do you think she intends to use it in her social game?" asked Emily with a nod of anxiety. "Possibly," acknowledged her mother, "but that doesn't mean we must retreat immediately. It just means we must go with eyes wide open, even wider than those who think they see more than they do." They accepted the invitation. That day, the Marquise's garden spread out like a carefully composed painting. Paths of light gravel, rose bushes in late bloom, benches of wrought iron painted white. The Duke awaited them standing, leaning on his cane, accompanied by a servant who discreetly withdrew upon seeing them approach. "Thank you for coming," he said, inclining his head. "I confess I feared I was too bold in my letter." "Not at all," Your Grace, replied Emily. Your invitation honors us. They immediately set off along one of the paths. Widow Rubles stayed a few steps behind, granting them just the privacy that was fitting. The air smelled of damp earth and foliage. Last night, when I heard your surname, began the Duke in a thoughtful tone, something seemed familiar to me. This morning, I asked to check some documents. Your father once worked for my house. Emily paused for a moment. Yes, Your Grace. He was steward of one of your estates in the north many years ago. He always spoke of you with respect until he fell ill and things complicated. He died anxious that he hadn't left everything in order. The Duke gripped the cane's handle tighter. Now he remembered with bitter clarity. Tangled reports, figures that didn't quite add up, rumors of missing funds. He remembered the surname Rubles linked to words like irregularities and negligence. I understand, whispered Emily, noticing the change in his tone. She felt a chill at the nape of her neck. Has something happened, Your Grace? He didn't answer immediately. The words seemed heavy. How to tell her that he had inherited the suspicion that her father wasn't as honest as she believed? And how to admit that for the first time, he wanted those old reports to be wrong? It was exactly then, at the end of the path, that the Marquise de Lon appeared, impeccable in a wine-coloured dress, as if she had calculated her intervention to the second. Her gaze stopped on Emily, then on the Duke, and a spark of resolve flashed in her eyes. The Marquise de Lon advanced along the path as if the gardens belonged to her not only by right of ownership but by right of destiny. Her wine-coloured dress accentuated her slender figure. Each measured step seemed designed for effect. Your Grace, she greeted with an impeccable smile. I see you've made excellent use of my little proposal. Enjoying the fresh air. The Duke inclined his head slightly. Your gardens are too beautiful to neglect, Marquise. Her gaze lingered a moment on Emily, then on Widow Rubles, assessing their faces with almost clinical precision. And I see you've been so kind as to invite the ladies, she continued. Do you like the gardens? They were designed by a rather famous French landscape architect in his time. They are beautiful, replied Emily politely. It seems they were made to forget worries for a moment. The Marquise nodded approvingly. Ah, worries, she drawled. Some are forgotten among the roses, others, on the contrary, bloom precisely when you think you've left them behind. The Duke caught the slight tension hanging in the air. Marquise, he said in a more serious tone, a moment ago we were speaking of Miss Rubles' father. It seemed to me I recalled his name in connection with my house's affairs. The Marquise's gaze flashed quickly. Ah, yes, Rubles. How could one forget? She made a small pause, savouring the effect of her words. Several years ago, there was some concern in the management of one of your northern estates, Your Grace. Contradictory reports, accounts that didn't balance. I remember it was whispered about quite a bit in certain circles. Widow Rubles straightened, paling. My husband was always an honest man, Marquise, she said quietly but firmly. If there were errors, they were the result of the illness that weakened him, not malice. The Marquise looked at her with cold courtesy. I don't claim otherwise, I merely mention what was said at the time. You know how society is. It feeds on half-truths when the full truth is scarce. Emily felt the ground sway beneath her feet. She had heard vague rumours after her father's death, but no one had ever said it to her face with such elegant cruelty. The Duke pressed his lips together. The reports I received then did indeed speak of irregularities, he admitted, but no final conclusion was reached. He hesitated a moment, was occupied with other matters. I didn't give it due attention. I understand, said Emily barely audibly. So for many, my father died under a shadow of suspicion. For many, any doubt suffices to pass sentence, interjected the Marquise, though of course there's always room for review. Her gaze lingered a moment on the Duke. Especially when certain people decide to take an interest in those who previously went unnoticed. The subtext was obvious, and Emily felt exposed, as if placed in the centre of a stage without warning. Marquise, said the Duke with a note of reproach, a person's honour should not be bargaining currency in social conversations. She smiled, utterly unoffended. I would never turn it into currency, Your Grace, but into an object for reflection, yes. After all, what each decides to believe about the past says much about what they expect from the future. After a brief nod, the Marquise took a leave and withdrew along another path, leaving behind a faint trail of perfume and an awkward silence. Emily took a deep breath. "If you wish, Your Grace," she said with difficulty, "we can withdraw. I understand these tidings change much." The Duke turned to her, frowning slightly. "The only thing that changes, Miss Rubles, is that now I know your family was treated unjustly. Or at least, that I didn't bother to clarify it. Perhaps the reports told the truth," she whispered. "I have no way to prove otherwise." "I have the means to investigate," he objected. "Account books, letters, records, all are kept in my archives. If you'll permit me, I'll review every document. I don't promise a result, but I promise honesty." Emily's eyes moistened, though she held back the tears. "I have no right to ask such effort of you." "It's not about right," he said with calm firmness, "but conscience. My conscience is uneasy knowing I may have tarnished a man who was perhaps simply ill, and his family's name with him." Widow Rubles nodded and whispered, "If you find something confirming the suspicions, Your Grace, we would prefer to know the truth. Shadows frighten more when they lack outlines." "I promise," replied the Duke. Soon the visit drew to a close. As they parted, the Duke gently touched Emily's hand, as if that light contact sealed a silent pact between them. That evening, at his writing desk in the company only of a lamp's light and the scent of fresh ink, the Duke de Valcastle began examining old folders marked with dates and names. Among them, one was written in firm handwriting. "To the north. Steward Robbins." Taking the first sheet, he called a servant. "Tomorrow," he said, "you will deliver a letter to Miss Emily Rubles. I want her to know the investigation has begun and that, until I see clarity, my behavior may seem distant to her." The servant nodded silently. Emily, unbeknownst to her, slept restlessly, as if presaging that the next day's new letter would bring a mix of hope and fear. The letter arrived early, before even the baker passed the street. The postman knocked with two not too loud raps, and when Emily opened the door, in her hands was an envelope she recognized instantly. The same seal, the same coat of arms. She climbed the stairs almost without feeling the steps her mother followed silently and stopped at the doorframe. She broke the wax seal. "Miss Rubles, last night I gave you a promise, and a man should not trifle with such things. I have begun reviewing the records related to your father's management. However, I discovered this task evokes more memories than I supposed. If in the coming days my behavior seems distant or indecisive to you, attribute it not to lack of respect for you, but to the need to resolve matters I myself left pending in the past. I prefer to be cautious rather than unjust again. If you accept this explanation, I shall be at peace. With sincere regard, Valcastle." Emily read every line twice. In those words was an honesty that touched her and, at the same time, a contained fear she understood all too well. "He's not withdrawing," she whispered. "He just wants to be just. That already distinguishes him from many," said her mother. "He could have left it all as is, but he doesn't." Emily replied with a mix of pride and anxiety. Meanwhile, in the Duke's house, the atmosphere was far from that of a ballroom. The large writing desk was piled with account books, bundles of yellowed paper, and letters tied with faded ribbons. Morning light poured through the tall windows, but he, sitting with a straight back, relied on other senses. "Place to my right the books for the year the Rubles family fell ill," he directed. To the left, the previous ones. His secretary, a mature man with a deliberate voice, complied. "Do you wish me to read the figures, Your Grace?" "Start with the reports I received after his death," said the Duke. "Then we'll go backward. If anything doesn't match, I need to hear it. Hours passed amid figures, descriptions of harvests, repair expenses, notes on shipments." Sometimes the Duke closed his eyes, focusing on the rhythm of the words, as if intonation could reveal what the ink did not. "Here," announced the secretary suddenly, "the first mention of irregularities appears. Signed not by the gentleman, but by the assistant accountant, sent on recommendation of." He paused. "Of the Lon family." The Duke frowned. "Read the detailed report." It spoke of missing sums, double payments, hasty decisions by the steward. The more he listened, the more something grated inside him. "Is the gentleman's health mentioned?" he asked. "Only in passing. The steward appears tired, sometimes distracted," read the secretary. "Nothing more." "And before this assistant accountant's arrival?" insisted the Duke. "Were there complaints?" "On the contrary, Your Grace. There's your letter of thanks for the accuracy of the accounts, and a note from your former butler saying, 'Mr. Robbins is a man of his word. His conscience weighs more than gold. The Duke thoughtfully placed a finger on the table. So between trust and suspicion, there's a very sharp break. While he delved into the papers, the Marquise de Lon prepared another scene. That day she arranged a small reception in her coziest salon, inviting only a few ladies and gentlemen of fine judgment and engaging conversation, as she liked to say. Emily and her mother received the invitation with surprise. "If we don't go," said the widow, "it will seem we are afraid of the gazers. And we did nothing shameful. We merely danced and spoke truth when necessary." Emily whispered, "and said the truth when it was needed," added her mother. "That shouldn't be cause for shame." The reception salon was smaller than the grand ballroom but equally meticulously adorned. Armchairs upholstered in soft tones, dainty porcelain tables, trays of sweets. Conversations distributed into small circles. When Emily entered, she immediately noticed the light buzz of curiosity. It wasn't hostile, but insistent. Some ladies greeted her with measured courtesy, others looked with overt curiosity, as one looks at a new book before deciding whether to open it. "They say the Duke is reviewing some old land matters," noted a middle-aged lady seated near the circle where Emily settled. "And that it all began after one waltz." "Still say," added another with a mysterious smile, "that his heart isn't as closed as some thought." That one young voice achieved what the official salons couldn't. Emily felt the blood rush to her face. She pretended to focus on her teacup, but heard every word. The Marquise, from the other end of the salon, observed silently. She had let the rumor circulate with delicacy, not to humiliate but to gauge reactions. She wanted to know who would approach Emily out of calculation and who would distance themselves out of fear. At that moment, a servant bent toward the Marquise and handed her a note. She read it quickly, her brow arched barely noticeably. Then, with a thin smile, she raised her gaze to Emily. The note was brief. "Marquise, the records don't match the suspicions. I need to speak with you about the accountant you sent to my northern holdings. Valcastle." The Marquise calmly folded the paper. She understood two things at once: that the past was about to be truly reviewed, and that the Rubel's surname wouldn't easily vanish from conversations. The reception continued amid not too loud laughter and weighed remarks. Spoons tinkled in porcelain cups, fans opened and closed in their silent language, and the music of a small string quartet filled the gaps conversation couldn't reach. Emily, seated at a low table with almond sweets and small pastries, strove to maintain composure. She knew that though no one said it openly, many of the gazes exchanged above her head were tinged with curiosity. She had stopped being invisible, yes, but she wasn't sure she fully liked the light now following her everywhere. "Miss Rubels." A courteous male voice pronounced her name. She raised her gaze. Before her stood Don Leon de Herrera, a knight of about 40, sturdy build and open gaze. He wasn't the richest or youngest in the hall, but all respected him for his sound judgment and restraint. "Of course, sir," replied Emily, gesturing for him to take the neighboring seat. "I've heard," he began, taking a cup of tea, "that you had the courage to dance with the Duke when no one else dared." Emily felt the blush threaten to flood her cheeks, but held back. "I wouldn't call it courage," she whispered. "It simply seemed unfair for the music to surround him without touching him." "That's precisely what courage is," objected Don Leon. "To see injustice and decide not to partake in it. And as for the Duke," he smiled faintly, "he's a man who learned at the cost of blows not to trust most gestures. Yours must have seemed entirely different to him." Before Emily could reply, another voice joined their circle, higher and laden with somewhat cloying courtesy. "Ah, Don Leon, always so poetic." It was DOA Beatriz de Palma, an elegant lady known for her skill in gracefully recounting rumors. But sometimes we confuse generous impulse with imprudent audacity. Her eyes fixed on Emily, gleaming with curiosity. "Audacity," repeated Emily calmly. "Oh, of course, dear," continued DOA Beatriz, fanning herself gently. "To approach the Duke so closely when his position is so different from ours. You know how people gossip. One dance can turn into a story, and a story into expectations. And when expectations collapse, the one with the least power usually suffers most." The words were soft, but Emily caught the hidden edge. And yet, she decided not to retreat. "I understand what you mean," she replied, "but I also know that if I'd stayed seated in my chair pretending not to notice him, I'd have been ashamed of myself for a long time." I prefer to face a rumor than my own cowardice. Don Leon let out a short approving chuckle. Well said, miss. DOA Beatrice pursed her lips slightly, though the smile remained. Let us hope the story proves benevolent, she said, for your sake and the Duke's. She withdrew to seek another group of interlocutors, leaving behind a dense aroma of perfume and a light trail of unease. Emily stared thoughtfully at her teacup. Sometimes I wonder, sir, she confessed to Don Leon, am I not walking on ground that could collapse beneath my feet? Perhaps, he conceded, but perhaps you're paving a path where there was only underbrush before. The difference will be in what the Duke does with what you've shown him of yourself. Emily fell silent. Her father's name, the irregularities, the Duke's promise to review the documents, all mixed in her head like pieces of a puzzle not yet fully assembled. Meanwhile, at the other end of the city, the Marquise de Lon crossed the living room, far more austere than her own salons, toward the Duke's cabinet. He had accepted her invitation to converse with a curious smile, though part of her felt the meeting wouldn't be as light as talks of flowers or social evenings. The Duke stood by the fireplace, leaning on the marble mantel. He wore not a ceremonial frock coat but a simple dark suit. His face's expression was serious, though his voice retained its habitual courtesy. Marquise, he greeted. Thank you for coming. It's always a pleasure. Your Excellency, she replied, sitting, and no one needed to indicate where. I assumed you wished to speak of less frivolous matters than balls. Precisely, he said. It's about the Northern Estate and the years when Mr. Rubles was steward, and what happened after. The Marquise interlaced her hands on her knees. I understand. I've heard you're reviewing old documents. Not only documents, he objected, but letters as well. Among them, several in which you strongly recommended an assistant accountant named Ganvest. A spark flashed in the Marquise's eyes. Ganvest, she repeated. Yes, I remember him. A very promising young man, as I was assured. Methodical and reserved. They said he could bring order where others saw only chaos. In his reports, said the Duke in a restrained voice, chaos appeared precisely then. When Mr. Rubles fell ill, sums began to disappear, duplicate payments appeared, hasty entries. He painted him as a negligent man. That's what I was informed, replied the Marquise. I merely recommended someone who, by my sources, was competent. The Duke turned slightly toward her. And were your sources equally competent to explain why this very Ganvest vanished from the face of the earth years later, with gambling debts and a ruined reputation? The Marquise paused a moment before responding. I wasn't aware of those details, she confessed with half honesty. It's true I heard something of his fall, but by then he no longer had ties to my affairs. But I do have ties to mine, said the Duke. And after hearing all the documents, I've concluded that the sudden disorder in the accounts coincided with Mr. Rubles' growing weakness and the arrival of an ambitious accountant who had much to gain by sowing distrust in the steward. The Marquise sighed deeply, observing the man before her. Blind, yes, but with a perspicacity many-sided men lacked. Are you implying I was complicit in an intrigue? She asked with a slight chill in her voice. No, he replied calmly. I'm implying that, perhaps unwittingly, you handed a weapon to someone who didn't hesitate to use it. And I, through my negligence, allowed the shadow to fall on a sick man, and then on his widow and daughter. A tense silence hung. And what do you intend to do now, Your Excellency? Asked the Marquise. Correct what can still be corrected, he replied. Ask forgiveness where it belongs and make it clear in the circles where your opinion carries weight that the Rubles' name should not be synonymous with suspicion. The Marquise's eyes narrowed slightly. As you rightly say, my opinion carries weight, she conceded. And I don't like being linked to imprudent decisions. If your investigation proves the Rubles family was victim of a combination of illness and malice, I'll be ready to set it right. To say aloud what has been whispered so long. That would suffice to begin, said the Duke. However, she added with an old calculating spark in her gaze, you should know that thereby you'll also lend strength to the story already circulating the salons. The one of the Duke who lets himself be moved by a young woman without fortune. The Duke smiled faintly. I've been accused of worse, Marquise. If I'm to bear a rumour, I prefer it be one of having tried to be just. The Marquise regarded him at length. For the first time in a long while, she had the impression her threads couldn't control all the consequences of this move. Very well, she said finally. When your conclusions are ready, send me a copy. I'll do my part, with my words, in the right places." When the Marquise departed, the Duke remained motionless a moment, hand on the armchair back. Then he called the secretary. "I'll dictate a letter," he announced. "It's not addressed to an accountant or the Marquise, but to someone whose opinion matters more to me than all of theirs combined." The secretary took up the pen, ready. "Miss Rubles," began the Duke in slow, careful voice. "In the old books I found something more than figures. The weight of an error I for years refused to face squarely. Before telling it to anyone, I must tell it to you. If your mother permits, I'd like to receive you both at my home in 2 days. There are truths that must be spoken face to face, even for a man who can no longer see faces but can still feel them." While the pen scratched on paper, far away in a literary salon's drawing room, Emily felt a strange shiver, as if fate had taken another step toward a point she couldn't yet discern. The Duke's letter arrived exactly 2 days later, as he had stated. The same envelope, the same wax seal with the Valcastle arms. Emily held it a moment between her fingers, as if the paper weighed more than it seemed at first glance. She opened it carefully, sitting at the small dining table while her mother prepared coffee. "Miss Rubles, I've progressed far enough in studying the documents to understand it would be disrespectful to prolong the silence. There are things I must say to you and your mother personally. Things touching not only your father's memory but my own conscience. If you deign to accept my invitation, I await you at my home tomorrow at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It will be an unusual social visit, I warn you, but I want it to be an honest one. With respect, Valcastle." Emily read the contents aloud. Widow Rubles turned from the stove, wiping her hands on a cloth. "So he's found something," she said in even tone, but her eyes shone with agitation. "He fears what he's about to tell us," added Emily, unsure if it was hope or fear squeezing her chest. Her mother set the cloth on a chair and sat opposite. "Whatever it is, daughter, we'll face it together. We've lived many years with unanswered questions. Perhaps the time has come to hear even what pains us." "So we'll go?" asked Emily. "Of course we'll go," replied the widow. "Your father always spoke of the Duke as a man capable of greatness. Perhaps this is one such case." The next day, a modest carriage bore them to the Valcastle residence. The Duke's house wasn't excessively opulent, but every line spoke of the solidity of several generations. Facade of light stone, wrought iron balconies, tall windows spilling light. Descending from the carriage, Emily breathed deeply. She wore her best dress, the same blue reworked with a few elegant adjustments by her mother, and a simple coat. She'd arranged her hair more carefully than usual, in a low chignon out of respect for the moment. The butler, with majestic air, led them through the spacious vestibule adorned with ancient portraits. Emily couldn't help lingering on one. A young man with a lively gaze in a dark uniform, confident and almost bold expression. "That's the Duke when he could still see," whispered her mother. Emily looked away, moved by the difference between that man in the painting and the one who had taken her hand at the ball. The same, and yet so different. They were shown into a bright drawing room with high ceilings and walls lined with bookshelves. It wasn't a cold reception room for duty visits, but a lived-in space. A folded plaid on an armchair, papers stacked on a table beside an inkwell, a forgotten magnifying glass. The Duke rose at the sound of their steps. He stood by the window, leaning on his cane, dressed with impeccable austerity. Sensing their presence, his face softened. "Madame Rubles, Miss Emily," he greeted. "Thank you for coming." "Thank you for receiving us, Your Grace," replied the widow with a curtsy. Emily barely managed hers, for her hands trembled slightly. "Please, be seated," he indicated. "This time I don't want us to lack time for the main matter." They sat. The Duke did too, but leaned forward, placing his hand on the low table separating them, like a man approaching confession. "I've reviewed the account books of the Northern Estate," he began, "not only for the period when your father fell ill, but for the preceding years. I've read reports, letters, steward's notes, and spoken with one of the few still alive who work with him." Emily felt each word pierce the room's silence like a nail in wood. "What I discovered," continued the Duke, "doesn't match the image of a dishonest man." He raised his face, as if seeking reaction in the dark. "For many years," he went on, "your father was described as precise, meticulous, sometimes overly scrupulous in expenses. There are entries where he complains of unnecessary luxuries, Excessive festivities, he sought permission to cut certain expenditures he deemed superfluous. Widow Rubles clenched her hands on her knees. Yes, that was my husband, she whispered. He always preferred duty to show. Then came the illness, said the Duke more slowly. Minor errors began appearing in the accounts. At first, nothing serious. Understandable distraction. At that moment, the Marquise de Lon recommended an assistant accountant, Ganvest, to help him. A tense silence fell. The serious errors, continued the Duke, appeared only after Ganvest took more direct control. There are discrepancies matching the accounts. Sums moved from one book to another, and curiously, certain funds that seemed to vanish only to resurface in investments linked to third parties. Do you mean? Emily didn't finish the question. I mean, replied the Duke with calm firmness, that everything points to your father being used as cover. A sick man is the perfect scapegoat for those seeking to divert money without raising suspicions. He had the opportunity, and he took it. Emily felt the world blur an instant before her eyes. It wasn't sorrow, but something like relief so strong it hurt. Does that mean my father? The Duke inclined his head toward her. I can't swear with the law's required precision that he was entirely uninvolved in every falsified figure. No one can now. But I can say with the certainty of one who has examined the whole story that the most reasonable explanation is that he was victim of a combination of illness and malice. His prior character, his conduct, the testimonies confirm it. He was an honest man. Widow Rubles brought a hand to her lips, stifling a sob. It wasn't unrestrained weeping, but a broken breath releasing years of silence. Thank you, Your Grace, she whispered. You can't imagine how comforting it is to hear. The Duke turned slightly toward her. I know, madam, he said quietly. I know a belated pardon doesn't return years lived under suspicion. But however late, it doesn't cease to be necessary. Therefore, there's something I must do now. He rose with such a resolute gesture that Emily's heart clenched. She thought he would call the butler or produce some document, but no. The Duke took a few steps forward, feeling with his free hand until he reached the table's edge, and then bowed his head. It wasn't a superficial salon bow, but a deeper, more intimate gesture. A nobleman seeking forgiveness. In the name of my house, he said, and my own name, I beg you to accept my apologies for not having investigated sooner, for allowing the Rubles name to bear for years a shadow that, through negligence, I didn't wish to dispel. Emily rose almost mechanically. Your Grace, I beseech you, she murmured, do not bow so before us. I should have done it much sooner, he objected without moving. I can't change what was, but I can change what will be henceforth. Widow Rubles rose too, with the calm and dignity that always accompanied her. She approached and gently touched the Duke's hand. I accept your apologies, she said, voice still trembling. Not because a duke brings them, but because a man with sincerity utters them. My husband would have preferred truth, though late, to convenient silence. Only then did the Duke straighten fully. He looked relieved and, at the same time, more vulnerable. I've spoken with the Marquise de Lon, he added. I showed her the documents, pointed out the inconsistencies, reminded her of her imprudent recommendation, and she agreed to publicly rectify. Emily raised her gaze, stunned. Publicly. Tomorrow, he explained, she'll host a small reception, more select than the grand ball, but with people who most influence our society's opinion. There she intends to announce that, after thorough review of the facts, it's established that the Rubles name should not be linked to suspicion but to diligence and the misfortune of illness. The widow pressed a hand to her breast. This changes much. I know, nodded the Duke. I also know that thereby the rumours around you will change character. Some will draw near out of self-interest, others out of sincere desire to revise their judgments. Therefore, before all this begins, I wanted to speak with you alone. Then he addressed Emily directly, though his eyes couldn't see his attention envelop her wholly. There's yet something more I must tell you, he added more slowly, something related not only to account books and not only to public reputation. Emily's heart leaped. I am listening, Your Grace. He drew breath, like a man about to step onto a bridge with no return. When you crossed the hall that evening, he began, I thought it merely an impulsive gesture. Then, compassion for a man who lost his sight. Later I understood it was something far greater. A choice. The choice to see whom all preferred to ignore. He paused briefly. Since then, Your voice has become something I recognize even amid noise. Your words challenge things I took for granted. And as I unraveled the past's errors in those books, I couldn't help but wonder if fate gave me another chance to revise what I feel. Emily felt time stop. She clasped her hands on her knees to hide the slight tremor. Your Grace, she whispered. I don't want you to think, he continued, that my desire to right the injustice to your family stems from selfish personal interest. Truth had to come to light regardless. But it would be dishonest to admit that now my heart is not as indifferent as a few weeks ago. His words weren't fervent or dramatic. They were slow, cautious, as if each had been polished before leaving his lips. Tomorrow, he said finally, when the Marquise gathers her guests and clears your father's name, many will watch us. Some will want to see you as the young woman restored to society, others, the grateful daughter accepting belated amends. I don't know which image will prevail, but... Emily raised her gaze, captivated by the seriousness of that voice. That I know for certain, continued the Duke, that I don't want you to be alone amid those gazes. Neither now nor later. I also know it's unfair to ask you to respond to something so important hastily. He extended his hand forward, groping the air. Emily took a step and carefully placed hers in his palm. The touch was simple, but full of meaning. Tomorrow, he continued softly, closing his fingers over her hand, when the Rubel's name and mine sound in one hall, many will ask what binds us. I only want to ask you one question. Not for you to answer now, but to keep it in your heart. Emily barely breathed. Are you ready, Miss Emily? Pronounced the Duke in a firm whisper. Would you allow the world to see that I not only righted an injustice, but chose, among all hands that might seek mine, precisely yours? The ensuing silence was so deep the faint crackle of the fire in the hearth could be heard. Widow Rubles looked at her daughter with moist eyes but said nothing. She knew that answer belonged not to her. Emily opened her mouth, feeling a wave of emotions overwhelm her. Gratitude, fear, hope, a new tenderness she didn't dare name. But before she could utter a syllable, a soft knock sounded at the door. The butler peered in discreetly. Pardon the intrusion, Your Grace, he said. An urgent message has arrived from the Marquise de Lon regarding tomorrow's gathering. The Duke carefully released Emily's hand, as if loath to break something fragile. Leave it on the writing table, he directed. I'll have it read later. Then he turned to Emily with a barely perceptible smile. Don't answer now, he repeated. Tomorrow, at the Marquise's house, when all look and rumour tries to name what we are, it will suffice for you to decide where you choose to stand. Beside me or apart. Emily's heart beat so strongly she almost mistook its thuds for the drawing-room clock's ticks. For the first time she clearly understood that tomorrow's day would not only clear her father's name but stake her own name and that of the man who had invited her to dance when no one wanted to approach the blind Duke. The evening at the Marquise de Lon's house had a different spirit from the grand ball. There was no full orchestra or dazzling chandeliers. Only a narrower circle of invitees, familiar faces and names that shaped rumour's form and opinion's weight. In essence, it was a small court clad in silk and velvet. Emily arrived on her mother's arm. The carriage halted at the grand staircase, and she alighted feeling a slight tremor in her knees. The blue dress, reworked and ironed once more, enveloped her with restrained dignity. She wasn't a young woman adorned with jewels, but a new firmness read in her posture. We can still return, whispered Widow Rubles, more to test her daughter's resolve than because she truly wished it. Emily shook her head gently. We've hidden too long. Today I no longer want to hide. Not for me, not for Papa. They entered. The salon chosen by the Marquise was more intimate than the grand ballrooms. Walls hung with light tapestries and portraits in frames, a central table gleaming with glasses prepared for a toast. Conversations paused only an instant as Emily and her mother appeared on the threshold. Just enough for all to see them before the whisper resumed, now tinged with curious anticipation. The Marquise approached with a calculating but softer smile than before. Madame Rubles, Miss Emily, she greeted. I'm glad you accepted the invitation. Thank you for the reception, Marquise, replied the widow with restrained respect. Emily inclined her head, noting how some gazes already studied them. DOA Beatrice with her fan at the ready to catch every nuance, Don Leon with his open gaze and subtle gesture of support, other ladies and gentlemen whispering names and memories. Little time passed before the whisper turned to a new wave of attention. The Duke made his entrance, accompanied by a butler. He wore an impeccable dark suit, light waistcoat, perfectly tied cravat. The cane in his right hand tapped softly on the floor. When he appeared in the salon, a silent wave rolled through the room. It was the presence not just of a duke, but of a man around whom a multitude of stories had been woven. The blind aristocrat, the jilted fiancé, the lonely ball guest, and now the man who had ordered old accounts reviewed. His face turned slightly toward the Marquise, following the sound of her steps. "Marquise," he greeted. "Thank you for receiving us all. It's an honor for me." "Your Grace," she replied, "and if you'll permit, I'd like to say something before the evening proceeds as usual." A servant offered her a glass, which she didn't yet take. She moved to the salon center, where light from the windows fell strongest. All understood it wouldn't be idle talk. "Dear friends," she began in firm voice, loud enough to be heard by all, "you know I value the art of conversation. But I also know that sometimes words weigh more than years with them." Gazes crossed in expectation. "Many years ago," she continued, "among some of us spread the opinion that one of the Duke de Valcastle's land stewards acted dishonestly. That man's surname was Roubels." A light shiver ran through Emily, but she remained still, back straight. "I myself," confessed the Marquise, "imprudently recommended an accountant who helped sow doubts. I didn't investigate sufficiently, didn't ask questions that should have been asked. And though time passed, the shadow remained on a surname undeserving of such burden." She turned slightly toward where she knew Widow Roubels and Emily stood. After verification conducted by the Duke himself, she pronounced clearly, "I've learned details I previously ignored. Years of honest labor, grateful letters, testimonies speaking of a diligent and worthy man, undermined only by illness, and of the dubious conduct of those who exploited his weakness." She raised the glass, without drinking, like a small standard. "Therefore I declare here and now, before you all, that the Roubels name should be associated not with suspicion but with diligence and honesty. If ever my words or silence fed those doubts, today I deny them and replace them with this assertion. Madame Roubels and her daughter deserve the same respect as any honest family in this city." Several seconds of complete silence followed. Then someone began to clap. It was Don Leon. Others joined hands, first cautious, then with conviction. The applause grew until it became full acknowledgement. Widow Roubels' eyes brimmed with contained tears. Emily felt her heart overflow, as if each clap tore away a piece of the burden she'd carried since her father's death. The Duke stood motionless, listening. His face's expression was calm, but his hands betrayed deep emotion, as if those applause returned something lost to him. The sense that justice was restored in time. When the applause died, the Marquise allowed herself a light smile. "And now," she said, "let the evening take its course. We've placed the words in their places, remains to see what our hearts do with them." Conversations resumed, but the tone had changed. Several ladies approached the widow to greet her with more warmth than ever. Some gentlemen bowed slightly to Emily as if seeing her truly for the first time. DOA Beatrice drew near, fan in hand, somewhat less haughty than on other occasions. "Madame Roubels," she said, "Miss Emily, allow me to say I'm glad all is clarified. Sometimes we repeat things without knowing the harm they can cause." "This harm is heavy," replied the widow without sharpness, "but today it begins to dissipate." DOA Beatrice seemed to search for words and find none that didn't sound empty. She took leave with a light curtsy and moved to another group. Emily, meanwhile, felt a mix of gratitude and vertigo. She knew the decisive moment hadn't yet arrived. The Marquise had cleared their surname before all, but the silent question the Duke had left her the evening before remained. As if hearing her thoughts, the butler approached the Duke and whispered something in his ear. He nodded and took a few steps to the salon center, guided delicately. "Marquise," he said, "would it be improper to ask your small quartet to play a waltz?" Some guests exchanged surprised glances. A waltz, after all, in a small ball. But the request echoed something familiar. The Marquise instantly grasped its weight. Her eyes found Emily's, met them, and something like a fleeting camaraderie flashed in her gaze. "It would be entirely proper, Your Grace," she replied. "On the contrary, I think it timely." She signaled the quartet in the corner. The musicians tuned their instruments. In moments, the first notes of a waltz filled the air. The Duke froze in the center, without cane, hands clasped behind his back. His face held no arrogance or theatrical confidence, only patient expectation. He didn't utter Emily's name, didn't call her. He simply stood there. Gazes began shifting from the Duke to the girl and back. The memory of the grand winter ball surfaced in many minds. That moment when no one wanted to dance with the blind Duke until a figure in a blue dress crossed the hall. The story, thought Emily, has brought us back to the same point. But we are no longer the same people. Her mother looked at her silently. There were no speeches or advice, only a light nod as if saying, "This is your decision, but you're not alone." Emily's heart pounded with force, but her feet knew the way. She breathed deeply, gathered her dress's folds to avoid tripping, and took the first step. Then another. Each step crossed a sea of gazers. They weren't the cold gazers of the first ball, now they read curiosity, respect, even a spark of hope in some eyes. But there was calculation, silent whispers, self-directed questions. Midway, Emily recalled the Duke's words. "I don't want you to be alone amid these gazers." And she understood that, in truth, neither was he. As she continued toward him, she reached the place where he stood and stopped one step away. She saw the slight tension in his jaw, the contained expectation in his upright posture. "Your Grace," she pronounced in clear voice all could hear, "would you grant me the honor of this waltz?" The whisper died as if someone had snuffed it. The assembly fell silent, only the music continued, true to its rhythm. The Duke smiled slowly. "Miss Emily," he replied, "it would be an honor." And with the answer, he extended his hand. She took it without hesitation. His skin was warm, firm, and the way he held her hand spoke of a decision already made. As they took position, some guests held their breath. The Marquise watched attentively, but her eyes now held no calculation. Something closer to strange tenderness. The Duke took the first step. Emily followed his lead. The waltz enveloped them like a perfect circle. Their movements held no showy pomp, only serene, conscious elegance. He couldn't see the faces in the hall, but she saw surprise and admiration, and even a moved smile on Don Leon's face. "Does it not displease you?" she whispered as they circled. "Does it not seem excessive? Those who would measure our life by what seems to them," replied the Duke softly, "are not the people meant to share it with us." Emily raised her gaze to him. "Share it." He smiled slightly. "Don't fear that word. I ask no final answer amid this waltz. I only want you to know that if you choose to walk beside me, it won't be as a grateful daughter rehabilitating a man, but as the woman who decided to take the hand of a blind Duke when no one else dared." But the waltz continued, tender and deep. The entire hall seemed to revolve around them, as if walls, paintings, and tapestries witnessed a new story. When the music reached its end, the Duke and Emily closed their embrace just enough for a final curtsy. An instant hung frozen in time, then applause broke out. Warmer than before, more personal. They were no longer for an abstract declaration, but for a visible choice. The Marquise de Lons stepped forward a few paces. "Your Grace, Miss Emily," she said with a smile that this time didn't seem rehearsed. "Some dances change the season's direction, others change our very way of viewing the world. I dare say this belongs to the second kind." She surveyed the salon, aware each word of hers carried weight. "I believe we've all witnessed something more important than mere reputation restoration," she added. "We've seen what happens when someone refuses to be invisible, and another refuses to remain isolated out of pride or fear." She stepped back, leaving the salon center free for them. The Duke leaned toward Emily and spoke so low only she could hear. "I don't ask you to decide everything today," he said. "But if someday we live under one roof, I promise my home will be a place where no one else feels invisible. Not you, not those who come knocking at our door." Emily felt her eyes fill with tears, but not of sadness. They were tears of recognition, relief, that joy arriving when justice and love finally meet at one point. "I don't know what the coming years will bring us," she replied in trembling but clear voice. "I only know that where others saw only shadows, you chose to seek truth. And that where I saw a man withdrawn to a corner, I found one ready to share his light, even without seeing it." He gently squeezed her hand. "Does that mean—" "That means," she interrupted, drawing breath, "that I don't want to be apart from you when the world looks. Neither today, nor tomorrow, nor—" There was no immediate formal promise or solemn announcement. That would come later. With time, long conversations, and walks in quiet gardens, with the widow Rubel's serene approval and society's curious acquiescence, which would gradually accustom itself to seeing Valcastle and Rubel side by side. But for many, that day imprinted in memory as a simple image. The blind Duke standing amid the salon, and the girl in the blue dress taking his hand with the same firmness as she had extended it the first time. Music, gazes, whispers, all blurred around them. Thenceforth, when anyone recalled this story, there was always a phrase that expressed it exactly. No one danced with the blind duke until one girl decided that true blindness is pretending not to see him. Final reflections for the listener perhaps. Hearing this story, you've recognized a bit of yourself in Emily. Sometimes invisible, judged for what you lack, for what others said about your name or your past. Or perhaps you've felt like the Duke. Set apart, reduced to one trait, as if your worth dimmed with something you lost. This story wants to remind you of something simple and profound. You are not the version rumors invented. You are much more than your mistakes, your limitations, or the labels others pin on you without asking. There are people like Emily who dare look deeper, and there are moments when you yourself can be that person for someone. An extended hand, a voice breaking silence. Mature love doesn't come to save, but to stand beside. It doesn't erase the past, but chooses to view it with truth and mercy. And above all, it reminds you it's never too late to right an injustice, seek forgiveness, believe you deserve a second chance. Perhaps today there's no orchestra or ballroom, but there is a quiet decision capable of changing your life's course. Approach whom you've avoided, forgive yourself for what you didn't know, allow someone to see you as you truly are. And who knows? Perhaps you'll discover the most important moment is not the one.